Oh, my God.
The show is on.
JohnFord.radio.
What a car, what a price, what a dealer, wasn't he nice?
Meow.
For a brand new Ford or a fine used car, here is the dealer, take our advice.
And now, on today's program.
Well, here we go. It's the John Ford Podcast, number 40.
Great.
So glad you could come along. I am your evening rankerist here on the Evening Ranker, the John Ford Podcast. Now, kids, I am no expert at podcasting. As you can tell, I've only done 40 of these stupid things. But my many decades in broadcast radio has taught me a couple of things. And the one thing I'm going to talk about first is something I'm not going to do today. How is that for not paying attention to your own advice?
Right.
One of the things you learn in broadcast radio, especially in talk radio, which a lot of my experience comes from, is that you want to jump into what you're going to talk about immediately. Now, as I listen to a lot of people that do podcasts, it's obviously something that many of them have not learned. You'll hear the beginning of the podcast. Now, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and I listened to about 2 minutes of it because that was all I could take.
Bye-bye.
And it's a podcast that's very well known by a very well-known personality, a comedian who I happen to like, who I think is very funny, who I've interviewed before and is a very funny guy. But they start the podcast, and it's him and his co-host, and they're just chuckling around, and they're talking about inside stuff that nobody knows anything about, that they were obviously talking about before the podcast began. And that's another thing you learn from broadcast radio, is that you've got to give people, you've got to let them in on what's going on. It's okay to have inside stuff, but you have to bring them inside so that they understand what that inside stuff is.
Yes.
Because they don't know. Even though it's all straight in your head, the listener doesn't know what the hell you're talking about. Try to give you an example of this. Even if it's something that you've shared with the people listening in radio or in a podcast, for that matter, you can't assume that they've listened to everything you've said or that they were listening 10 minutes ago. They could have fast-forwarded at a podcast, or they could have been listening, just tuned in on a radio station. You can't assume that they heard what you said 10 minutes ago, 10 hours ago, 10 days ago, 10 years ago, because they may have just started listening.
All right.
Now, in talk radio, one of the things you try to do is you try to go ahead and, as quickly as possible, this is a really hard thing to teach radio talk show hosts, that because they want to come on the air, they want to, okay, the music starts, they're coming on, they're going to start to talk, hey, how is everybody? Boy, let me tell you, and then 3 minutes later, they're finally going to get around to what they're going to talk about. It's why it's so important that when you first start the podcast or radio broadcast, as I said, I am no podcast expert.
No.
I'm just bringing some of the things that I've learned from broadcasting into podcasting that a lot of broadcasters don't even know. Get to what you're going to talk about right away, because it brings them in. It brings the listener in. They know exactly what it is you're going to talk about from the beginning of the show, as opposed to talking about what color your socks are, what your dog ate for breakfast, the kind of cheese that you like, and then fishing around with giggling with your producer for another 30 seconds, and then going back and talking about why you like Argyle socks, and then getting to your topic. Why is it every time I do a podcast, my dog it starts growling? Hear him? There is a cat. I'm going to do exactly what I'm telling you not to do. There's a cat that hangs out right outside the window of my studio. And he pisses off my dogs to no extent. And you know how... And so I egg them on and I go, where's that pussycat? Get that pussycat. For some reason, we have lots of feral cats in the neighborhood that I live in here in beautiful Austin, Texas. So anyways, back to the topic. Yes, get to it right away. Start talking about what you're going to talk about immediately, because people are going to get bored, man. And you know what? The chances are you're boring enough anyways.
Yeah.
And chances are your topic is boring enough anyways. But get to it as quickly as you can. And quit fiddling around. Quit fishing around. That's just a little something I'm passing along today from my many years of experience in broadcast radio, especially personality and talk radio. Not that I necessarily have a personality. Not that I necessarily know how to do this crap.
No.
But I'm just passing it along because I think it's something that will be of use and of value to you as you continue your podcast journey.
It's the John Ford Podcast, the Evening Rancor.
JohnFord.radio.
Okay, I'm going to follow my advice and jump into what I'm going to talk about very quickly and show you how it's supposed to be done, I think. Every once in a while, you run across one of those articles on the internet where you just say to yourself, this has got to be the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. This has got to be the pinnacle of bad ideas. So I come across this article on the Daily Mail. I prefer the Daily Fail, but, I kind of like the Daily Mail. It's sort of like the New York Post of the UK papers. That a bunch of scientists want to create what they call moral AI in your Google or your Amazon home device that you talk to, that listens to you. Like when you say, Alexa, pick my nose.
Oh, please.
And then it says, I don't know what you're talking about. So anyways, these guys want to create smart assistants. It's smart about it. They want to create smart assistants that will have moral values, that will be able to decide whether or not to report their owners to the cops for breaking the law. This is not a joke, right? I also found this on Ziff Davis.net, so it wasn't just on the Daily Fail. So it's a bunch of researchers, a bunch of eggheads, a bunch of scientists, academics at the University of Bergen in Norway, whose name probably is all Schwen. So they've touted the idea that this conference, which was held in Hawaii, and God bless them, if they live in Norway, they would have probably come up with anything to push at a conference in Hawaii just to get away from that frozen hell land and the fjords and have a little tropical thing, on the beach.
Bloody anarchists.
So you can't really blame them on that. So they're pushing for this artificial intelligence that will suggest your digital assistants, like your Amazon Echo or your Google whatever, should possess an ethical awareness that simultaneously represents both the owner and the authorities. So it's going to make a judgment call. Or even like a minor for your kids. The kid's playing with the stove. Probably not a good idea. Let's call the fire department. Now, that may be a little far-fetched, but so what it'll do is it will listen in on you, which they already do. And I have to admit, these things are creepy. They really are creepy. But I have one. I have an Amazon Fire TV, and that damn thing's listening to me all the time. I very rarely use the voice thing on it. Like the only thing I use it for is I say, Alexa, what's the weather? What's the current temp? So I want to know how, should I bundle up? Should I put on a pair of socks? As a kid who grew up in Florida, I don't like to wear socks. If it's, below 70 degrees, I got to wear socks. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. So these things would listen in, and if your home assistant, if your Amazon Echo or your Google Home device feels that you're doing something that's illegal or immoral, it's going to call the cops on you. These guys are actually pushing for this. They think it's a good idea. This is proof positive that academia has gone completely off the freaking rails.
Yes.
I mean, do you want Orwellian society? Because this is exactly how you get Orwellian society. Now, one thing that it doesn't mention in this, and like I said, these guys are serious. They really want to do this. People think about this. Okay, so my device at home is going to figure out whether or not to call the cops or whether or not I've done something illegal, and should I be turned into the authorities or should I be reported? What you have to remember is with these things, when they talk about algorithms and it's going to make this decision, it's going to weigh this stuff out, it can't do it for itself. The only decisions it can make are what the programmer has written into the machine learning that it has. You can let your mind wander and think about how completely out of control this could get, depending on who, because they can put all sorts of their particular prejudices or what they feel is illegal or what they want to report you on. A crazy conservative might, they're smoking pot in the house, got to call the cops. A crazy liberal might, oh my God, they said something that's offensive to someone. And in England, if you say something that's offensive to someone, they can come after you and fine you, put you in jail practically. It's already illegal there, to voice an opinion. So whoever writes the code for this will obviously put their presuppositions into the device. So this idea of this AI having moral equivalence, it's whose moral equivalence is it going to be? That's not even going to the fact where we're dealing with a Terminator situation where it's completely gone off the rails and it's going to turn you in for picking your nose, or that it, quote, is allegedly making decisions on its own and that it's become self-aware. Who the hell wants an Amazon Echo or a Google Home that's become self-aware? I can't think of anything more horrifying, except for maybe pictures of Donald Trump naked. So yeah, this gets my award as the really bad idea of so far this year. Well, it's got to be rank up there in the top 3 or 4.
Yes.
Smart assistants that can turn you into the cops. Not a good idea.
It can only be attributable to human error. It has always been due to human error. This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.
It's the Evening Rancor, the podcast from that guy who talks about stuff, John Ford. Any links mentioned on the show are available at johnford.radio. Today, we're coming to you direct from your mom's basement. Welcome to the Evening Rancor, the John Ford podcast.
So I'm just going to go back to talking about podcasting here for a moment, if that's okay.
No.
I know that in some ways there's nothing more annoying than self-serving things that just serve themselves. Wait a second. Does that make any sense? I don't know.
No.
In other words, a podcast where you talk about podcasting. But I guess people talk about things that interest them, and at this point I'm doing this stupid podcast crap, so I might as well talk about that for a moment. So I'm going to relate a little story. A couple of segments ago, we talked about getting to your topic as quickly as possible, which I am trying to do here. Here's another little tip for you. Just a tip. We'll just put the tip in.
Use a rubber.
A couple of months ago, I went up to a taco joint taco joint that's pretty close to where I live here in Austin, Texas. We got good taco joints here. This one I can actually walk to. It's physically maybe a block and a half away. So I'm standing in line at this taco joint, and I'm talking to this guy. I have a tendency to talk to people. This is something I noticed here in Texas you can do. You can just start talking to people in the line at the grocery store, at the taco joint. You can smile and wave. Whereas other places I've lived, you can't do that. They think you're crazy, or they think you've got some ulterior motive, or, nobody trusts anybody. Here you can just start up a conversation with somebody. It's very, very simple and very easy to do. And it's kind of a good thing. I like it. It's something I like about Texas. So I strike up this conversation with this guy, and he says, well, what do you do? And I told him that for money these days, I do voiceovers primarily. And he says, oh, that's kind of interesting. How'd you get into that? And I told him I was in broadcasting for God knows how many years. And he asked me and says, well, do you do anything with podcasting? Because I told him I had been involved in a radio consultancy and had taught people how to do radio and talk shows and things like that. He says, would you ever consider consulting podcasters? And I thought, well, I really don't know that much about it, and I don't do it myself. The thing that kept me from doing it, I told this young man, this rather handsome young man, I told him that the thing that kept me from getting into it was the barrier to entry. Now, eventually I ended up doing it anyways. Obviously, I'm doing it now. But I came to the conclusion that the reason I wanted to do it was just to shoot my big mouth off behind a microphone. I got this groovy Neumann microphone. I got this groovy little studio for my voiceover stuff, so why the hell not do a podcast? I figured, go figure. But I told him that I always thought the problem with podcasting was a barrier to entry. And he says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, unless you're famous or you have a big name or you're, NPR, you've already got the space carved out for you, there's a huge barrier to entry. So if me, as Joe Blow, does a podcast, it would take forever to get people to listen to the thing if you ever get to that point anyways. And I have no delusions or illusions of grandeur on this. If somebody wants to listen, they can listen. If they don't have to, and whatever I get is whatever I get. Because like I said, I do this to just shoot my big freaking mouth off anyways. But I started to think about the barrier to entry thing. So unless you were like one of those girls with a big rear end, the Kardashians, or somebody that's already got a name, it's going to be difficult to get people to listen to your show without just going out there and just prostituting yourself. Please listen to my show. Please listen to my podcast. And I've never been one of those that was great at doing self-promotion anyways. I think it comes from my upbringing, where it's, don't toot your horn so much. You're not all that. Don't pretend you're more than you think you are. Whereas we live in an age today where people just get off on pretending they're more than they think they are. With their Facebook posts and how great they are and how wonderful their life is and how exciting it is and all the wonderful things they're doing, when in reality they're sitting at home picking the cheese out of their toes and they're depressed because they have no real friends. Don't think that's not true? You know it's true. So the barrier to entry in podcasting has always been kind of difficult. It's a difficult concept. And I was thinking about how that relates to broadcasting. With broadcasting, the barrier to entry was, as I think it was Ben Franklin that said, freedom of the press only belongs to those who can afford one. Well, you could only get into broadcasting if you had the dough to buy a radio station, which you don't actually even really own. You just own a piece of paper from the government that says you're allowed to broadcast on that thing as long as you don't abuse it and as long as you serve the public interest. So unless you had a tower, unless you had a stick, unless you had a radio signal, you couldn't get into it. That was the huge barrier to entry. Whereas the barrier to entry in podcasting seems to be how famous you are, how well known your name is. So basically, I told the guy that the barrier to entry I thought was so high. And it kind of reminds me of the statement I used to always make about recording studio stuff, musicians. It used to be years ago, if you wanted to record, you had to go to a recording studio or literally spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to build your own. It was a very expensive proposition. I mean, nowadays you buy a Mac or whatever, and you've got GarageBand, and you can kind of create your own music if you want to call it that. So the barrier to entry to that has come down so far that pretty much anybody can call themselves a quote-unquote musician. Now, I play guitar a little bit. I've been playing it a long time. It used to be really damn good until my hands gave out. I never even considered myself a musician. I was a player. Hey, you know what? Charlie Parker and Mozart, they're musicians. I was never a musician. Yet any kid with a Mac and what's that stupid sequencing program that begins with the letter R, I can't think of what it is. Is it Reason? I think. Can create these loops and call themselves a musician. So I used to always say that the greatest thing to ever happen to music was computers, so that anybody could create music. And the worst thing that ever happened to music was computers, because anybody could create music. So you end up with so much crap and people convincing themselves that they're great. How this all relates to the barrier of entry to podcasting, I'm not quite sure. But, I read that there's thousands and thousands of podcasts launching each month. And I'm sure what happens is people do them for a few weeks and then figure out, well, this is kind of hard. And just sitting behind a microphone and shooting your big mouth off and making even just the tiniest modicum of sense is not easy. And I think a lot of people are finding this out. People used to say, especially disc jockeys, disc jockey is used to, that's the guys that, hey, they talk between the records. Good morning, I'm talking between the records. Up the music. Here's the new hit from the big sound in the big city. Hey, baby. Disc jockey, right? A lot of them wanted to become talk show hosts. And I would say, well, go into the recording studio, go into the production studio, the recording studio and the radio station. No music, and just open the mic and talk for 10 minutes. And then record it and let me hear it. And so these guys or girls are used to speaking in 15, no more than 30 seconds at a time. And when they have to sit down in front of a microphone, naked to the world, with nothing but them and their shorts, man, and try to speak for 10 minutes and have something coherent or even mildly coherent or even, just a tiny bit interesting to say or even entertaining, it ain't that easy. And I think a lot of people find that out when they get into podcasting. How this all relates back to the barrier of entry, I'm not quite sure. But I was going to say is maybe we could call it podcasting blocking.
I expect when you sit at home trying to understand one of these shows, you think that we're all top-class professionals who perform everything absolutely perfectly first time around.
He's an idiot.
Well, I think that's all I got for this week. I could come up with something else to bitch or complain about, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a restaurant with a guy who's eating a hamburger. There's got to be something there. But I'm kind of out of gas. Thanks for joining us for this week's Evening Rancor, the John Ford podcast. And until next week, that's the way it is, baby.
It's time to say so long. Sorry to say that it's time to go. Remember the spot on your radio.
All right.
There'll be more entertainment for you that you'll find so enjoyable too.
Are you nuts?
So tune in on Monday, because that is when that man
He's an idiot.
will be here.